And so noise manifests through a rapid succession of environmental events of dynamic intensities and durations across physical space, creating an unintentional mixing event that is perceived by a listener. So my interpretation of noise combines a couple of concepts that comes from Gaver's ecological approach to everyday sound. And the idea of the environment is quite important because Gaver understood that sound was formed in connection to the environment. So if you want to understand or find out or study sound, then your best point is to start to look at the environment itself. The second concept comes from Cresson and this idea of the mixing effect. And that is where sound is unintentionally or intentionally mixed for the listener to hear. So for sound, and I was quite interested at this point, quite early in my research, I was quite interested in sound in the urban environment. And much of the sound that we hear within that space is unintentional, which means it doesn't have a design intent behind it. So my interest in noise, and I should say that my PhD research started back in 2015, but I wasn't really focused on the idea of noise. It was more about having a connection to noise because I was working with quite noisy materials. So my introduction into noise actually started with this idea here, which was presented through Kevin Lynch, not David Lynch. But it's this idea of legibility, and this idea of legibility resonated with me as a sound designer because it talks about the way in which urban designers organise their materials to construct a coherent image within the physical space. So what Kevin Lynch did in his early practice, and I'm specifically talking through the article, which is on the right-hand side of Walk Around the Block, was that he actually went out and spoke to people to understand how they perceive their physical surroundings. And that is predominantly from the visual perspective. He then wrote a book called The Image of the City, and I highly recommend that if you're interested in sound and you're interested in the urban built environment, this is a really good point, or is a good stepping point. And so this idea of legibility, I could see a parallel with my own practice as a sound designer because I'm always considering the organisation of sound in time and its relationship to other sounds. And in my earlier kind of work as a freelance sound designer within theatre, noise, or the idea of noise, was always considered a problem. It was always considered an object that was there to be reduced, and it was about the amplification of a message. And so if you had sound or a type of sound that obstructed that message, then it was always something that we would try to reduce as much as possible. And so what David Lynch's ideas what it did for me at least, was that it made me aware of three very important domains as I started kind of working through my research. The first was, of course, the physical environment, so having an understanding of what sound is doing within the physical environment and how it's created. The second is, of course, a social component, and that is speaking to people and understanding how people perceive their environment. And the third is, of course, a technological element, which is how we use digital tools to work with the materials. And so working with sound and working with noise is something that I was extremely interested in. And so this kind of led into my very first project in my PhD, which I called Urban Conversations. And it adopts a Lynchian approach, which was covered in his paper, his article, A Walk Around the Block, in which he started from the ground up. So not coming at sound or coming at the organisation of the environment through a high-level approach, but understanding how people perceive it. And so, armed with this kind of knowledge, I started to explore the urban environment, and with me I would always take a camera and a recorder, and I would take photos of anything that interested me. And the idea that somehow something would appear to me in a way that would represent visually, there would be an equivalence in terms of sound. So I was interested in the way in which the urban environment was organised, and I wondered if that type of organisation also existed in the sound environment. And so I set out, within my very first project, I recruited visually impaired participants, and the assumption on that was that they were keen listeners. It doesn't make them better listeners, but it makes them much more aware of what is occurring within the environment through what it is that they hear. And so that, and these images here are essentially a grab bag of from video that I was taking. So I would take a walk around the city and I would have a conversation with them. And more often than not, the topic of noise would come up. And I think in general, everyone's opinion of noise was something that it was essentially environmental pollution. But on a much deeper level, I could sense from the way in which they talked about noise that it was actually informational. And so they were listening to the wash of noise around them, and they were listening to the changes occurring within that sound. And so you would, if you were to walk within the urban environment, you would experience it as well, but possibly you're not aware of it. And so there are subtle changes occurring within the noise around us that imply changes that are occurring within our immediate environment. So things such as open doorways, poles, bins in the street, they would all be able to detect that because it changed the balance of noise within the sound. So unfortunately, we kind of speak of sound as though it was a singular feature. And for every moment we're in the city, our ears are subjected to a cacophony of sound that surrounds and bombards. In these moments, our minds are continually at work, processing and ordering a multitude of environmental signals to build a coherent and temporal picture of our surrounding environment. So I'd like to kind of quote Ben Anderson, whose work is predominantly within the world of sociology and within non-representational theory. But he says, there is no order, but a multitude of orderings and practices. And practices are the context and necessary condition for those orders. So if you can imagine your own experience within the urban environment, there is a multitude of different practices, activities occurring around you, and you can see them unfold over time. So these were a couple of protests that I attended in 2015, and I was actually interested in these type of multi-layered orderings and how you would experience it. And I quite like this middle image here, which shows a convoy. This is at the firefighters' protest. And so you can see the convoy of protests following up the street. Now, in a protest, generally what happens is you will ultimately shut down all the traffic. But you see the pedestrians on the side of the road, all standing, waiting, as if they're waiting for a light to cross. And so there is inherent behaviour that we kind of follow to a rhythm that we know. And so there is a very different type of order between, say, the firefighters and how they chant and their rhythm, to say, compared to the Omeo protest, which is very much culturally driven. So it's a very different type of, I wouldn't say musical arrangement, because it certainly wasn't musical, but it was a very different order to experience. And so I want to kind of now shift to practice and a view of sound design, so my own practice, that is designing in the presence of noise. So sound design concerns the organisation and transformation of sonic events through an intentional mixing of frequencies, intensities and durations across time and space that is perceived by a listener. So I've intentionally used similar language to what I used in my description of noise, but the difference here is that it's intentional. So the mixing of the qualities of sound is intentional for a certain type of audience. And so the next project I undertook within my PhD was to examine the urban environment and its sonic, its kind of sonic qualities by taking a walk through the Melbourne metropolitan environment and specifically focusing on the Hoddle Street grid. So the map that you see in the top left-hand corner is what is the Hoddle Street grid. And the walk that I went on is indicated by the varying kind of colour-coded lines. So we start at Victoria Street, take a walk down to Flinders Street, and then walk all the way back. So that would take about an hour's walk, and I would walk along each of those streets. These are different representations, flattened representations of the streets. So you have Russell, Swanston, Elizabeth, and then William, Queen, and King. And I separated each of the recordings into blocks. So each block or colour-coded block was labelled, and then that would give me a duration in which a certain in which a certain recording was taken. And then what I could start to do was compare through various types of analysis, compare the differences that were occurring along the street. So spectrographic analysis occurring within it, you'll see a very faint blue line. So I was undertaking what is called feature extraction. And then next to that is another visual representation, which is looking at a comparison across the different streets based on a heat map. And then leading into that, or taking away from that actually, these one-dimensional line interpretations, which are essentially what formed part of, oh my God, which essentially form part of, essentially form part of my sonification work. So a way of being able to use sound design tools and methodologies to understand whether there was a certain type of order that I could perceive within the environment. And so just to run through just a couple of these, this is a comparison of loudness levels across the three different streets between La Trobe and Lonsdale. So I believe that's just outside of Melbourne Central. So it's actually quite a short walk. Across the top is the heat map, and so we have Russell, Swanston, Elizabeth, Queen, William and King. And so in terms of loudness, you can immediately see that Swanston Street is much quieter in that segment compared to the others. So again, that is loudness. And so if you have a look at King Street, which is quite interesting, King Street is a major thoroughfare for vehicles, heavy vehicles, and you would expect that to be much louder than any other street. If we then have a look at the pitch variation, we have an entirely different story. On Swanston Street, we have a very active pitch relationship, and that pitch relationship is caused by human activity, namely the voices of pedestrians all moving around Melbourne Central. And then on King, where predominantly vehicle traffic, we don't see much activity in terms of pitch, so it's quite stable. what you see at the very end there is from car brakes. So car brakes sit at about 4,000 hertz and they create this long, elongated screeching sound. And then finally, another interpretation here is the percussive events. So I was looking at the different types, different harmonic, but also percussive events occurring within that. And so we can see that across Swanston Street, there is a huge amount of pedestrian activity. And then the other streets, we have a smattering of different types of signals, construction work and everything. So I essentially had, through the analysis of the street work, so these quite noisy materials, I essentially had the elements to undertake a sonification of this noisy material to try and understand whether there was a perceptible pattern appearing within the sonic domain. The sonification undertook a process which worked with binaural audio, which was then band split across 4 different frequencies, so trying to target very specific frequencies in which certain sounds would appear. So we have predominantly low engine throbbing sounds occurring within the low frequency, the sound of people, and then we start to move up and towards things like car brakes, horns, and everything like that. That then moved into a series of separation, so harmonic and percussive separation, feature extraction, filtering, creating a score for the sonification, using Super Collider to construct the actual model of the sound, and then creating and mixing that work to then finish the actual piece. So I actually have some sound of that. Now, one thing I did notice today was that... No, that's better. Okay, so that's much better. So yeah, so you can hear all the percussive elements occurring within the interpretation, and so sonification is essentially a translation of data into sound. And so what I was starting with was sound data, and so I had to translate sound data into raw data, meaning one-dimensional data, and then sonify that data in order to hear those patterns. And so for me, in going through this work, I believe there's a couple of takeaways for me, just in terms of working with sonification, working with quite noisy data, and trying to understand whether there are patterns occurring within it. And I believe taking an ecological approach is that we can start to kind of work between two types of listening environments. One which is quite analytical, that is, there is this repetition and a really descriptive element to what it is that we're hearing. And the other is that we can quite easily flip from that into an experiential, which becomes more of a shared experience, is less analytical, is fleeting and non-descriptive. And this is something that essentially, I'm kind of well over time, aren't I? Yeah. Okay. So an ecological approach and working with sonification was really something that I started to work on quite intensely. And this kind of segues into a project, or actually into an MDIT studio that I ran in 2018 in semester 2. And it was a collaboration between myself as a sound designer and Professor Jeffrey Cook, well, now Professor Jeffrey Cook, who is the director of the Centre of Astrophysics and Supercomputing at Swinburne University. And we decided to run a studio involving this interaction between designers and scientists to try and understand, well, to try and solve a particular problem that they had within their field. So this was run in 2 sections. The very first section was a technology intensive, where I would take the students through the different types of sound design technologies, and then they would take that knowledge and start to design something within the second stage. This is the team. So this is the design team back in 2018. It was actually quite good. I got to meet some of these people again on Monday. So we have a very small sound design team, and then on the other side we have our astrophysics team. So these were the high-performing students from the first stage. So hand-selected went into the second team. So we have Damni, Shang, Matt, Vikram, and Joseph. So a little bit about the team in its hand selection and the way that we organised the overall team for the work was that we had a team lead, which is essentially what Joseph was doing. Joseph was client-facing, so he was the one that would do all the presentations with the client, do all the communication with the client. And then we had two researchers, so Damni and Matt, and those two researchers would then be supporting their programmers, which was Vikram and Shang. And we split the team into two. One would be looking after a visualization side, and the other one would be looking after a sonification side. So they would be kind of in parallel, horizontally, talking to one another. So we spent a bit of time at the Keck room trying to understand and familiarise ourselves with their work. This was a bit of a culture shock for MDiT students because when you start to mix scientific language with design language, it's hugely confusing. So that was actually a really extraordinary experience, but it was important that we all got together to understand, to kind of discuss the problems within the domain and start to work towards a potential solution. So this is the problem as it was presented to us. This is the image that Geoffrey Cook drew on the wall, and this is something that we immediately understood. Show us an image and we can understand it. So what we had to do is we needed to discriminate between two different types of objects. One is a star-based object that has a very specific, a very focused light pattern, and then the other was a galaxy which has this very long, elongated shape. And so the work that Geoffrey Cook is doing at Swinburne is kind of pushing the boundaries of science. So this is a couple of images that was taken of a celestial event, and this is happening right on the edge of their technology. So they're really pushing the limits of what is possible with their technology. And so you'll see this event suddenly appear and then disappear. I like to describe it as what you're seeing is a star exploding, but it's a flare event. So something is happening there and then it's suddenly disappearing. And we needed to come up with a solution to detect those. So they're two very different problems. One is temporal, in that it's constantly changing, and the other one is that we have these very static objects existing in the sky. So we started with some very clean data. So this is what you would call clean. This is near detection of celestial objects. So we have a couple of galaxies, and you can see these spiral galaxies have an ellipsoid kind of shape. Easy to detect, low noise background, so there's no problem being able to detect those sonically. One approach that we took was that we would turn the image into what is essentially a spectrogram. So we'd read across the image from left to right sonically, and we'd interpret those different objects as sounds. So you'll hear one interpretation of this without noise. So the stars appear as almost like birds chirping. The galaxy, because of its long elongation, is a big whooshing noise, so we can easily detect those. And of course, when you start to think of that against noise, One thing you hear from the noise is that it's relatively stable, which means that we understand that the background is not very complex, there's not a lot of activity going on, and so that potentially was one approach that we took towards it. Stop. And if we have a look at the spectrogram, you can clearly see that the sound information closely follows that of the actual visual image. You can see some artifacts occurring within it, so there are potential problems within that process. You can see the two objects that are closely connected, so we would perceive that as one object, but you would, if you were listening close enough, you will hear that drop in pitch. But then we're given this. So this is the actual data that we started to work with. It's extremely noisy. And so the approach that I presented previously was not going to work. So we're working with extremely noisy data. We still had to detect these objects in the foreground. And what we ended up with was essentially using algorithms, using computer vision, and then using the data that was extracted from the computer vision side to then feed a physical model of sound. And so this, if I can just play this is what that would sound like. So that is without noise, so I'll stop there. And then this is of a galaxy. And then this is with noise added over the top, and that is a reflection of the amount of noise within the actual image itself. Okay, I won't go through that, but some of the things that did come out of this project was that once we had the data within the digital domain, we could actually start to represent that within three-dimensional space. And so there was a discussion that we had much later at the end of this project that it was possible to start to introduce VR within it, so we could interact within it within a three-dimensional visual space. So insights from that really is that, from all of this, is that an ecological approach to design, to the design of sound, offers sound practitioners a relational perspective for designing and creating unique listening experiences. Working with noise requires an application of creative methods and techniques for unraveling its complexity, both across the social, physical, and the technological. Sonification design presents opportunities for exploring patterns that emerge within noisy materials. And so I'll end with this quote from Kevin Lynch. Nothing is perceived by itself, but always in relation to its surroundings, the sequences of events leading up to it, and the memories of past experiences. So, thank you.